indicator that he has some sort of similarities. But one of the things that him and the Gnostics completely disagree about is gnosis. Marcion is not interested in secret knowledge, secret wisdom, internal attainment, and all that sort of stuff. Marcion is really interested in salvation. Marcion is all about law and grace. And the other thing that really and in that same sort of vein, the thing that differentiates him is he's an evangelist. The Gnostics were secretive, and they used to gather privately, from what we can tell, and they had no problem going to normal Christian services, some of them, but then at later dates gathering together to read their secret books or their secret meetings. Marcion wasn't like that. Marcion was an evangelist. He was a corner sort of preacher, if you can imagine. From what, you know, he got out there, he tried to get people to listen to him. He wanted everybody to hear this. Paul was his hero, and Paul wanted to, you know, preach the gospel to all people, and Marcion was that same sort of vein. So right there, they're the two major differences that you can talk about. There are a lot of other little nuances that they disagree on, and they definitely have points of contact, but they get there in completely different ways.
And so you said Marcion had a hand in forming the canon?
Sort of. He definitely, in my opinion, probably came up with the idea of the Bible as we sort of envision it, a collection of books anyway. I don't think he sat there and was like some people make it out that Marcion was like, oh, I've got a good idea for a bestseller, let's get these books together and make a Bible. I don't think that's how it happened, but I think he definitely articulated more than anybody at the time the authority that these documents potentially had when brought together. And I think when it came to the formation of the canon, most scholars, in my opinion, would definitely see that the Bible, as we know it, is the result of reaction. Most Christians have this idea that the canon was sort of this thing that was brought together in a nucleus, that it just happened over time, tradition brought it together, and they just all came to agree on these sort of books, and they were holy and they were canonical. I think what happened, and a lot of scholars feel this as well, is with Marcion going around with his collection of what is authoritative, what is canonical, so to speak, that raises the question, well, Marcion says this is canonical, we don't like this Marcion dude, so what is canonical? What does have authority? What does influence us in our thinking? What does formulate us? So I think Marcion's hand in the canon wasn't so much formal as it was reactionary. But if you've got any of your own opinions, I'd love to hear them. I'm learning just like everybody else. Every day I want to keep learning.
That's why I was actually wanting to hear your opinion, since you've been recently studying all about him and writing about him.
Yeah, well, like I feel like I've been thrown in the spotlight at a stand-up comedy night, but I'm happy to answer any questions people have got on Marcion if they just want to stroke my ego. Well, tell me.
So do you think there's any...
Oh, no,
I'm sorry. About when Marcion actually lived and how old he was at the various times of his life that we can document?
Oh, that is such a really interesting question. I take it you've read, or at least are familiar with the debate on this between Hoffman and Moll and Harnack.
I'm familiar. There's a debate on this, yes.
Yeah, basically the debate is, okay, how to put it. Basically the issue is Marcion is mentioned by a lot of early church fathers from the early to the middle to the late second century. And that alone indicates that he was active in some respect towards the beginnings of the second century. The question is how active, where, when, and all those sort of troubling things that happen with it. Um, yeah, from what I think Sebastian Moll, who wrote, in my opinion, the absolute best book on Marcion of well, probably the last decade, he has really studied the dates and the data, and I'm just shamelessly opening my thesis right now because I don't have the dates off my head. But he basically, Joseph Hoffman wrote a book called Marcion and the Restitution of Christianity, and his thesis was basically that the dating of Marcion should be a lot earlier. That Marcion was born in, I think, 70 CE. Yeah, 70. I've got it open now. And that would mean that most of his activity took place way earlier in like the beginning of the second century. And that completely threw everything out of whack because most scholars dated Marcion towards the middle of the second century. And one of the reasons why that's important is because I think for Christian reasons, they want to keep the harmony, or at least the perceived harmony, as late as possible. I think that's part of the indication. And the other problem is a lot of people don't think Marcion could have been as active as them. I don't think, I disagree with Hoffman. I think Sebastian Moll is basically defunct most of that. And Bart Ehrman's got a nice little thing on the dating of Marcion in his book, Lost Christianities. Um, but yeah, I think he was probably born probably in the year 100. To me, that's what makes the most sense when you look at Justin Martyr's Apology and Irenaeus, and even as late as Eusebius. I think when you collect it all together, that's what makes the most sense. I think that's the most plausible because you have to take into account Marcion's wealth when it comes to his ability to move around. And I know it's a little psychoanalytical, but if Hoffman was right that Marcion was born the time he was, that means he would have been 50 by the time he reached Rome. And I don't see it being plausible that Marcion would get rejected by the Roman Church and then set off to create his own religion as late as 50 in the ancient world. Sebastian Moll says that that's the sort of thing that a young man does. And I know that's like reading psychology into the past, but to me, the date and the actual argument's more plausible that Marcion was born around the year 100.
Well, on the other hand, when he arrived in Rome, he appeared to have been an established figure. Is that right?
Uh,
Which
that's a
might.
that's a later legend. That's a later legend. We don't actually know how established he was. Are you talking about the "I recognize you, firstborn of Satan"?
Well, didn't he arrive with a lot of money and a lot of influence when he came to Rome in the first place?
Tertullian says that when he arrived in Rome, he donated 200,000 sesterces to the Church of Rome. Um, so that's all really Tertullian tells us. And then he meets Credo, this mysterious figure who influences him, apparently, and then he starts to preach his gospel, and then the Romans kick him out. Tertullian actually doesn't establish he was. And the other issue is a lot of the stuff we have about Marcion's birth and youth, in my opinion, is very questionable. Like the fact that he was raised by a bishop father and that he sexually assaulted a virgin. I think they're very dubious information used by later Christian writers to make him look far worse than he is. In my opinion, I think he probably was raised in a Christian household. That would make sense to me why he has such knowledge of the Christian faith at such a young age, and he probably was wealthy. in some respects, either from family wealth or his own. He could definitely read and write, that's for sure. But I think he came to Rome already with this unique doctrine in mind, but and probably voiced his opinion, and that's what got him kicked out. I don't think he was as well established a figure as later writers think he was.
Okay, fair enough.
I could be wrong. I'll just throw that out there. I'm still learning. I don't have my doctorate. I don't even have my master's yet. This is all towards that. So I could get a big fat F on all of this. I hope I don't, but I just want to make that clear to people if they're listening to me. I am a Bible geek. I'm not the Bible geek.
So you wouldn't subscribe to any of those more far out kind of theories like he was the one who wrote the epistles of Paul?
No, I don't. Dr. Price and I would disagree about that. I subscribe to the very boring view that Paul did write letters. I probably not all of them. I definitely agree that he wrote what most scholars would consider the authentic seven. This is going to test me. Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Philemon, 1st Thessalonians, um, Philippians. I think that's all of them. I probably forgot something. But yeah, I think Paul wrote those ones. The rest are Deutero-Pauline, as they're called, or forgeries, if you want to be just plain about it.
Does anyone else want to talk?
Please. So how did you come into contact with Marcion, and what makes him one of your interests?
Actually, it might have been the Bart Ehrman book, and the way he described Marcion as being this sort of fanboy of Paul's, and it just sort of intrigued me. And a lot of times when I've done a little independent study, I've looked up stuff about Marcion, and I think maybe I've read one or two books about him. Maybe one that Dr. Price. I think I have one up on my shelf right now, and the name escapes me. It's one that Dr. Price recommended.
Cool. No, he's such an interesting person, and it's a real shame that not more people know about him, Christian or otherwise.
Yeah, actually, there was this website that I think it was Acharya that linked me to it, where these guys were talking about how all of the early documents where the word Christian appears actually originally said Christian, like Marcionites were Christians rather than Christians. Is that right? And
No, I haven't heard that. No, I haven't heard that before.
oh, okay. Do you want to talk about that? What didn't he teach the gospel of Jesus Christus, Jesus the good, rather than Jesus Christ?
Well, first of all, we're not really sure exactly what Marcion's Christology looks like. It definitely appeared that he had two gods, that's for sure. And there's been a bit of debate about what those two gods functioned like. Harnack in the early part of the century viewed that there was the god of justice, god of law, the just God, and that was the God of grace. And that's the way he sort of understood because of that Pauline influence, that's what Harnack understood. I tend to disagree. I think that Hoffman and Moll are a bit better on this, and I think Marcion understood the dichotomy between the two gods is purely just good and evil. I think it was that dualistic. I think if we can know anything about Marcion, he was definitely a dualist, and his God was good, his other God was really bad. So what I think in his mind, Jesus was a savior figure rescuing people from this maniacal, tyrannical God. I think that's what makes more sense to me. Beyond that, we don't really know. Some Christian writers think that Marcion's Christology was docetic, that he thought Jesus was a phantasm. And in fact, there's this really funny. I laughed at it the other day. Tertullian insulting Marcion says, I think something like this, that it would be easier to find a man without a heart and brains like Marcion himself than a Christ without flesh.
I don't know about that.
I know, it just made me laugh because, like sometimes you're reading these big, heavy, Against Marcion is not exactly light Sunday reading, but it is nice to know that even Tertullian and his Stortionists in the 2nd century had a sense of humor.
And that's all we've really got by Marcion, right? Is what's been quoted by his detractors. Oh, lost him. Okay, I'm gonna go get more wine. I'll be back.
Ooh, still there, Ruben? How you doing today, man? Room's dying faster than Jesus on the cross, bruh. Bringing reinforcements. What made you want to do this hangout today? Is the big man coming? Oh, okay. You have any elevator music you can play, Ruben, like as we wait?
Asked my baby, could she stand to see me cry? She said, yes, I could stand to see you buried alive. I'm mad. You done me wrong this time, baby. I'm mad. And you have the nerve to try to be glad. Now I can go down in the bottom of the sea, count the grains of sand, peek through muddy water and spy dry land. I'm mad. I'm mad. I'm mad. And you have the nerve to try to be glad. Now everybody wants to know about the clothes. But them fine dresses I've been buying you, you don't wear them no more. Won't be any more washing and hanging upside the wall and throwing them out the window, running out getting before they fall. I'm mad. I'm mad. I'm mad. And you have the nerve to try to be glad. I'm mad.
In the beginning, there were nothing but rocks. Then somebody invented the wheel. And things just began to roll.
Did you ever hear a tenor sax swinging like a rusty axe, humping like a frog down in a hollow log? Baby, that is rock and roll. Did you ever hear a guitar play?
Welcome back.
Where'd you go, man? Did your internet drop out? Daniel.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know what happened there.
Thought
Yeah,
you got raptured there for a second.
I think one of Marcion's evil god was just trying to stifle my views, I think. But no, I appreciate your questions. It's actually sort of a nice little sparring session testing me, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for refreshing me about Marcion. I haven't read anything about him in a long time. I'm planning on looking up your blog later and following to see what you have to write.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm planning to do the series probably in October, and that will get me warmed up for maybe tackling what will be my first popular book project. But we'll see. You know, I've got to enjoy freshly married life while I still can.
That is rock and roll. In the evening, baby, that is rock and roll. Boom, 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 I love you.
Hey, welcome in the room, Greg. Very lovely ceiling you have there.
Yeah, my mic's working, but I didn't want to compete with the boom, 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 boom.
Greg, we can hear you if you just say something.
Johannan asked me to fill in the awkward pauses with, said someone could fill in music with the awkward pauses, and so if anyone starts talking, if you hear music, I'll turn it back down.
Music's probably a bad thing, actually. Probably hit Ruin with a copyright strike.
Yeah, well, I've been doing pirate radio for a number of years now, so, you know, feeling guilty about copyrights is something that kind of flies right by me.
No, I hear you there. That's yeah. How you doing today, Kevin?
I'm doing good. Elated, exhausted. I had a great night, a lot of fun. So I'm kind of just trying to calm down, chill out a little bit.
It's the way to be, man.
Oh, what was that?
Just saying, it's the way to be, mate. Just take it easy.
Yeah, exactly. So I might be just listening for a little while until I kind of catch my equilibrium again. But I'm friends with Reuben, Bible Geek. So I know a fair amount about the subject. I wouldn't consider myself an expert, but I'm definitely a committed autodidact. So I do study a lot of spirituality, philosophy. I have a different focus myself, but that's for another time. I don't want to take up too much of the chat.
No, that's good. I've just been blabbering on about Marcion, so please take up as much as you want, but I know you want to rest, so yeah.
I practice a form of alternative spirituality that is loosely related to the neo-pagan movement. That's a form of something called polytheistic reconstructionism. The specific path is focused on ancient Greek, which is hence dubbed Hellenismos after Emperor Julian, the last person to basically name Greek religion. But in the process of getting to that point in my life, easily the last 15 years since, basically mid-adolescence, I've studied a lot of other things. I've studied Christianity, Islam, Judaism. I have whole books on Gnostic texts, the Pseudepigraphia, a lot of that kind of stuff. And there's a very important interrelationship between classical Greek religion and Hellenistic religions, like Christian Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and later Neoplatonism, especially that of Iamblichus. And knowing those sorts of distinctions are particularly valuable for an educated pagan like myself. So I'm always interested in kind of engaging in that sort of conversation. There's a lot that can be learned from either Bible geeks, just people who are genuinely interested in the historical aspect, or practicing Christians, whatever their variety, because so much of Christian doctrine is very much taken from Greek culture and Greek language.
Sounds fascinating.
Though it's important to mention as a sort of a semantical, or semantic distinction that, classical Greek or Attic Greek is different from Koine, and it's a minor difference, but it is there. So whenever you're talking to somebody about biblical criticism, depending on the period, it's really important to know your sources and to know what verb conjugations you're using and what versions, because the meanings of words that seem fairly standard do change over a period of only a few hundred years in this sort of transition and the standardization of language. Like our words for love in ancient Greek, their connotations became much more heavily Christian as you entered into the late Hellenistic period for obvious reasons. So too did philosophical terms like logos, which has so many different interpretations. So many.
Well, it's actually an interesting thing, because that's sort of the dilemma, not really dilemma, but just one of the issues I'm having right now, because I'm trying to get my graduates into a graduate program in biblical studies somewhere in the United States. I'm finishing up my master's, which is an Australian master's, and I have a pretty elementary grounding in Koine Greek, but what's really fascinating is as I look at programs in the United States, it seems that they want more, depending on the schools, they want more classical Greek. And I know there's a lot of point of contact and there's a lot of similarity, but I have to go back a little bit and brush up on some of my skills and go back to the 101s with a little bit more of my classical Greek. So yeah, and as someone who's learning that right now, I totally hear you that some of the nuances and the depth are either lost or just completely transformed by the time you get to Koine.
I would say it's sort of like this. Say you were a linguist and your focus was on Romance languages. It's a bitch to learn, But once you learn Latin, holy crap, the whole rest of it is open to you, because you basically, it's sort of like saying, I want to be a musician, but instead of playing something that's just easy to play, I'm going to play a difficult instrument that challenges me, that forces me to learn music theory. So by learning a more classical language with all of the sort of, and I don't necessarily call them complexities as much as peculiarities, I guess I like to use a little more quaint language when describing a language that is so different than English. By learning that, it really prepares you for everything else. A lot of Koine becomes easier, and then obviously modern Greek is sort of a breeze because of how much it's been standardized, even from things as simple as just pronunciation, not to mention obviously conjugation. So, absolutely.
Yeah, well, Latin's my next one to because it's one of those things where it's like I was considering Hebrew next, but it's not that I'm not interested in the Hebrew scriptures. I definitely want to study them more. But in terms of what I find in biblical scholarship, there really is a choice scholars have to make, I think, where, particularly with the state of the university at the moment, is are you going to teach, so to speak, Adam to Jesus? And that's pretty much Old Testament. Like they really just want people to teach. And when it comes to teaching, it's like introductory classes to at a secular university or a private university. It's really much general introductory classes that take them from Genesis 1 pretty much up to Jesus or Paul. Or on the flip side, it's like take them from Judas the Maccabees to Constantine. And you have to, and the way I sort of illustrate it is like this, there's definitely a crossover, but you have to pick what side you're on. And I'm much more like Augustine and Marcion and Tertullian and Irenaeus. I find those guys so much more interesting, and I feel like because they're not in the Bible, they don't get as much play. It's one of those things when I was picking where I want to go with my research. I was considering Paul, because Paul was one of my first loves with the Bible. But when I look at theses these days, it's like how many freaking dissertations can be written about the variation between two words in Romans chapter 11.
Sure.
And I know those are important debates, but when there's just nothing being written on Marcion or nothing being written on the early church fathers, or there's something, but there's just few and far between, it's like there's so much more we can study here. So that's where my studies sort of have formally taken me. But, still like the prophets and all that, they're cool.
Sure. Well, I think there's another aspect too to put on the table, or as a sort of point of consideration. It may not necessarily be in the very small span of time shortly prior and shortly after Christianization, but also the intervening centuries of Christianization, because there's a certain influence to the Latin Bible, especially during the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, and that kind of learning of Latin, especially the eccentricities of Latin, and in that period, the ecclesiastical Latin that we commonly term, it is quite valuable if that was your focus of study. Because that itself is a very interesting period of history with all the different revisions and different councils that went on past the Council of Nicaea, all the different reformations of the church and the schisms, and obviously leading up into the Reformation. So that's one other thing to consider. The second thing I'd say is if you have an interest in Latin, I would recommend, just as a self-taught aspect, go out and purchase Wheelock's Latin. It's a good, solid book. It's a course book in Latin, and they have a lot of guidebooks and compendiums and companions to Wheelock's Latin. They have it's a complete course that's quite often actually used as course material, or at least elements of course material in university. It's an excellent book. I have one on my shelf. If for nothing else, because of the way that it describes Latin, there's a lot of resources there available to you if you want to have a good understanding for a particular text, even if you're never going to speak it, because there's just a whole wealth of information that's lost to us as modern speakers. So that's my suggestion.
That's really handy. Thank you. It's basically when I'm done with my thesis, I had to start studying for this ridiculous GRE exam, which in Australia we have no concept of. So once that's done, I'm going to start applying to my schools, and as I'm waiting, and in that interim period until when school starts to wherever I get in, I'm throwing myself into Latin. So that sounds like a great resource, and I see you've got the link. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Jeffrey. But yeah, they have a good website, and I'm pretty sure there are online communities associated with Wheelock's Latin. You might actually be able to find study groups or at least discussion boards that have to do with it. If you look hard enough, I'm sure you'll find it. I mean, it's well known enough that there are people who are using it as a regular thing, that it's a commonly suggested and distributed resource. And look at it as that. Have fun with it. You know, if you can find other Latin speakers who have whatever their interest may be in Latin. I mean, there's a ton of that. I mean, a lot of it in law. Various sciences use Latin. There are a lot of people who do it for purely linguistic purposes because of how Latin is supposed to enhance the brain. It's a sort of classical music or chess for the mind, linguistically speaking. I mean, it's an excellently ordered language, which may seem pedantic to us as English speakers, but there's something to be said for a language that is so ordered when so much of our language is incredibly irregular, yet incorporating elements of Latin. So I think it can really challenge us and improve upon our speech by learning some of these classical languages. And I know other people who've done similar things with Old Norse. I actually had an English teacher who spoke Old English fluently, and he had took classes in it and became well studied, and he's taught a few people in it. So there's a lot of really interesting study in linguistics that will definitely tie into these subjects.
Very cool. Bit of Latin for our evening tonight. What about that?
If you're not having fun, remember, if you're not having fun, don't do it. And if you want to do it, make it fun. Find a way to make it enjoyable, because that is how you're going to continue. That's how you're going to develop the skill. It would be no different if I was talking to you and you were 6 years old and you really wanted to learn how to play the flute. I'd be telling you the same thing. Make it fun.
Honestly, that was like one of my struggles with Greek. Like, it was just not fun at all. Every book was just like just so boring, and I tried DVDs and I just couldn't do it. And I was in a classroom trying to learn it as well, and even that was just even more isolating. Plus, I was going through a really tough time at that point, so my mind wasn't really on it at all. But then I completely stepped away from it when I came back a year later, and I totally hear what you're saying. Like, the drive was just so much better. Like, I had just read, again, for the third time in my life, I had read Bart Ehrman's Quoting Jesus, and he really, really, at a very popular and basic level, if I was reading huge, boring academic tomes, he really stressed like how important language was, and he made it exciting. And even though there was like very little talk about learning languages in it, just the idea of it excited me. So learning it excited me.
Yes, really, it's you know, the saying from the mouth of babes. It's also from the mind of babes. We learn like toddlers. We do. We do have some excellent advantages by being adults, because eventually, once the actual competency comes in, then the grammar becomes very, very natural. Whereas with children, the grammar comes much, much later because their cognitive skills haven't reached that point yet. But ultimately, we learn pretty much the same. And there's a lot of elements to that, obviously, that I could sort of go into. One of which is immersion. You know, immersing yourself in language, putting yourself in a situation where you're not expected to know the language in its entirety when you form a sentence. Speak with the words that you know. Force yourself to learn it in that way. I actually found it. It came to my brain, thankfully. There is a video that you should watch. I have the YouTube link. It's from a gentleman who's an omniglot, and he he's from the TED Talks organization, does a lot of that kind of stuff. And he makes a claim right out the bat, how to learn and be fully fluent in any language in 6 months, which is a huge, enormous claim. And he goes into detail about his immersion in a different foreign language, which I won't ruin for you. But if you have the time, I would seriously recommend watching this video, because he makes a lot of very excellent and well demonstrated points about the acquisition of language.
And it's awesome. I completely agree. That is a really inspiring and thought-provoking one. So Kevin has been kind enough to provide the link, so I would recommend everybody check that out if they've got a cup of coffee and half an hour to spare.
The gentleman's name is Chris Lonsdale from Lincoln University. So it's good stuff. It's 18 minutes long, though, by the way, so you might want to set aside some time out of your calendar.
A cup of coffee.
Yeah, but I mean, he goes into very specifics. He goes into bullet points. It's a very good, I'd say almost dissertation on the subject. And a lot of the stuff he goes into is like looking how children learn language, how they acquire it, not getting into bad habits. It's those sorts of things. Like, I'll give you an analog that I can relate to here. Picking up a musical instrument again. I'm re-picking up the trumpet again. I used to play brass very well when I was younger. And I got a lot of really good resources on the concept of a comeback player, which is basically somebody who has not played for a significant period of time, 5, 10 years, which is basically me. The great thing about that is you unlearn a lot of bad habits, and then through relearning, you gain a certain appreciation for the learning process itself, not just the subject matter. You can immerse yourself in the process, which itself is fun. It's a sort of existential perspective on learning that I think is lost in a lot of the education system, especially in collegiate level, at least in my experience. But there again, I'm an autodidact, so I don't have degrees, or anything to that effect. But. The end of the day.
So, what's next on the agenda, everyone?
Daniel, can I pick your brain a little more? I just looked at my bookshelf and I read Marcion and Luke Acts by Joseph B. Tyson. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, it's on my bookshelf as well. I haven't gotten all the way through it yet, but yeah, fascinating theory. What's your thought? Do you want to explain to the group what it's about?
I think so. Dr. Price has talked about this a lot, the idea that Luke and Acts were written together in the 2nd century, and that there are quite a few sections of it that were actually polemics against Marcion and a sort of attempt to fold the Church of Marcion into the emerging Catholic Church. Or I guess you could call it Catholic, proto-Catholic.
Yeah. Basically, there are some interesting, what seems to be, to the group, what Tyson and Dr. Price has pointed out, what's fascinating in the Acts of the Apostles is there seems to be these little pithy throwaway lines that have nothing to do with anything, particularly with geography, which is really interesting. And what Tyson thinks he's discovered is anti-Marcionite polemics in Acts of the Apostles. For example, one of the really big ones is that, I'm probably going to misquote this, but the Gospels, sorry, not the Gospel, Acts of the Apostles says that Paul did not go into this region. I was like, well, why would you say that? And when you look at it, that's the region Marcion's from. And seeing as Marcion, this heretical thinker, mover, and shaker in the 2nd century, is claiming, in a sense, to be the spiritual successor and heir of Paul in the truest, deepest sense, Acts of the Apostle makes it fundamentally clear that these two have like nothing in common with each other. That Paul had no influence on this crackpot sort of heretic roaming around. So that's Tyson's sort of idea, and it definitely is an interesting one. I'm not sure if I buy it, and I really don't know exactly why I have hesitation. I don't like to jump into bed with any, like, the first good book I read. But it is an interesting theory. It's a really good book that I'd recommend people to check out in terms of alternative. More than his actual theory on Marcion, similar to what other people from particularly the Westar Institute have done, and Dr. Price being one of them, is that it definitely, in the opening sections, shows a lot of the dubious arguments for an early dating of Luke Acts. It definitely, more than his Marcion theory, it definitely questions the early dating. I think, like, the actual bedrock of the thesis is a little questionable, but a lot of, like, the side stuff is really juicy, and I think is going to open up very well in the future. The theory sort of goes back to F.C. Bauer and his idea that Acts was written as a way to sort of harmonize Peter and Paul, who represented Jewish Christianity and Gentile Christianity, and so that, like, Catholic, in that really loose sense of the word, harmonization. So Tyson is sort of like rebranding that in a way. It's not a very big book as well, which is good.
Yeah, that last thing you said kind of got cut off. I guess your stream went silent or something.
Oh, just basically that it's not a very big book, luckily, so you can get through it pretty quickly.
I'm looking up a link for it right now. There we go. I'll have it posted in just a minute.
Yeah. Marcion and Luke.
Never mind. I see John already found it.
Marcion and Luke Acts a defining struggle is what it's called for the listeners.
And it's a very thin book. It's actually a pretty quick read and very interesting.
Yeah, that's what I was saying before. When I got my hands on it, I was surprised how thin it was.
Well, you know, when you start getting into areas like this, you're into a lot of speculation, and there aren't a lot of sources to bring forward, or a lot of documents to reference. It's just, hey, I kind of have this idea that Luke Acts might have been written in the 2nd century by Polycarp and against the Marcionites, and this is what I have from the text to back it up. So I guess, it stays an extremely thin book that way.
I think Felix is showing off another really good book on it's called The Mystery of Acts. Do you want to talk about
that? Well, actually, I haven't read it yet. I'm scanning it for a friend who bought it for me. He bought it for me, and then I'll scan it because he's more or less blind or very difficult to read anything. But I know that the recent Acts seminar to determine the historicity of the book of Acts relies very heavily on his arguments. So I haven't actually read it yet, just part of the introduction, but he goes into who wrote it, when it was written, where, why it was written, how, and basically concludes that it's fiction and argues to that effect. So I know that that's the same conclusion that the Acts seminar came to. And not only Pervo's book, but also Dennis Ronald MacDonald's book. I can't think of it. He wrote a couple books on Homeric influence on the New Testament. That was very heavily influenced, or heavily influenced the Acts seminar too. So I wish I could afford their final summary conclusions, but it's probably going to be out of reach financially for me.
Yes, definitely not cheap.
Yeah, like Marcion and Luke Acts is out of my reach too. Even the used $29.99, I really can't afford to part with $30. That means food off the table.
Yes, luckily for me, I was able to borrow it from the University of Kansas library for free. So, got to return it, and it's one of those books that if you can get your hands on it from your local library, I definitely recommend reading it. But unless you're going to be studying Marcion and Luke and heavily, I don't think it's worth owning, in my opinion, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, this is just a hobby. It's not a job, so I can't invest all kinds of money from every whim of wanting to read something.
Well, I'm one of those foolish people who are trying to get a job in this field, so there's a few books I'm happy to own, some I wish I could get rid of.
So you're currently going to university right now?
Yes.
What's your field of study?
As we were talking about earlier, I'm doing my thesis on Marcion and 2nd century Gnosticism, but my interest ranges from basically Christian origins in the New Testament right up to sort of proto-orthodoxy and the heresies and all that sort of fun in the 1st to 4th centuries. That's my main area of interest.
Yeah, I want to change my major. Either history or something like that. Right now it's English and education.
Well, no, but it's not easy. Even though I'm through nearly T-minus 27 days until I have to submit my thesis and then hopefully get my master's at the end of it. I'm looking at my second master's at an American institution where I live now. And then going to PhD, but I know universities are not doing great after the GFC, and particularly religious studies. And being an agnostic atheist definitely makes the job field very difficult in the field of biblical studies.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I didn't think it would be worth a lucrative move to do something like that. Especially because with English and education and here in the States, you can get debt forgiveness. You can work 2 years, I think it is right now. It's probably going to go up, but right now 2 years you can work in what's considered a low-income school, and you'll be paying towards your debt, but at the end of that 2 years, the rest of your debt's erased.
One of my friends in Kansas is working on that as well. He's working on something like that. So yeah, it's very foreign to us Australians, your education payment system. It's because I came over here to America without debt, and looking at the price tags at some universities, I've basically my wife and I have made the decision that if I can't go to grad school for free, that I'm just not going. I'm just not that sort of person with money. Luckily, it's a bit easier at the graduate level.
Yeah, I constantly see on TV, because I live in Illinois, and I guess they do this so that politicians have something to run their campaigns on. So the latest is, well, you should be able to refinance your student loan the same way you really refinance your car loans and whatnot. So, oh boy, yeah, that's quite a bit of debt relief being able to refinance.
I was talking to somebody in a PhD program I was considering at one stage, and he was 60, and his attitude was, well, I'm just going to die in debt, so I don't really care. I'm just studying this because I love it. And I love that attitude. It's awesome that he's 60 and he's going for his doctorate. Good on him. But on the other hand, the whole, like, screw it, I'm going to die, so I don't really care about the money. Can't really say that as a 25-year-old.
Well, at 53, I can't say that either because I have to think about family and all that other good stuff. I don't think I'll be able to live long enough to get a doctorate.
So what about the idea that Gnosticism might have predated Christianity and was a Jewish sort of thing? I got that idea from a book called Gnosticism, Judaism, and Egyptian Christianity by Berger Pearson. Here, I'll go ahead and post the link over here.
I don't really buy the idea of Gnosticism predating Christianity, or at least not Gnosticism as we know it. First of all, Gnosticism is like next to impossible to define. If anyone's interested in defining Gnosticism and the impossible task of it, there's a really good book printed by Princeton University. I think it's called Dismantling a Dubious Category. I will quickly try and find a link for it. Rethinking Gnosticism, an argument for dismantling a dubious category. Really, really good book. That's written by Michael Allen Williams.
Yeah, I read most of that one.
Yeah, that's honestly like one of the best books on Gnosticism I've read in a long time. And Karen King from Harvard has a really good book called What is Gnosticism? And that's another, just the fact that whole books can exist about the definition and the problems of defining Gnosticism should indicate just how problematic it is. But in terms of like Gnosticism predating Christianity, I guess in a sense of like some mystery cults and mystery religions from Egypt and Rome, and like it really, I think it really boils down to your interpretations. If you're talking about like the sort of Christian Gnosticism, for lack of better terms, I don't think that's there. But yeah, in terms of Jewish Gnosticism, I don't think we know enough really. From my studies, like the more Jewish Gnosticism is late second century. It really doesn't seem to have such a stronghold as I think people, particularly in the 60s and 70s, thanks to Smittles, thought it had. I could be wrong, but I think it's a little bit overblown and people get a little bit too excited about this concept of pre-Gnosticism. But, what are other people's thoughts?
Well, the Enochian literature seems to me to be a good basis for having given rise to a Jewish form of Gnosticism that could have predated Christianity and, in fact, could have given rise to Christianity itself.
Are you talking about the Apocalypse? Enoch, which Enoch literature are you talking about?
Well, there's a number of books that are concerned with Enoch, and a lot of them are named after Enoch. And then there's mystical, and then there's the stuff in, I guess it was, Ezekiel, the famous passage that Rachel Elior says gave rise to Jewish mysticism way back in, possibly let's say 160s BC, probably would be the Dead Sea Scroll community, perhaps.
Yeah, but I think that's sort of the issue there. It's like, what do you define as ancient Jewish mysticism, and what do you define as ancient Jewish Gnosticism? And I know a lot of it has to do with semantics. I'm not sure what you mean by like giving origin to Christianity. I could be in the minority here because I know Robert's fan base. I'm not a subscriber to the Christ myth theory. So, that might out me right there. But, yeah, I guess it really comes down to definitions, and I just don't see it. I struggle to see it when some scholars point it out to me.
One book I got recently was Two Powers in Heaven by Alan F. Siegel. And some of the Jewish heresies, I know he goes into rabbinic Judaism, but what's Merkabah mysticism, okay, and its relationship to early Christianity, that there is some kind of Gnostic influence between the two. There's also another book called Jesus, Gnosis, and Dogma, but I can't think of the authors of that. And
yeah, Two Powers in Heaven is that's a really good book. When people,
yeah, I just got it.
Yeah, it's a really good one. Like, the reason why I really like it because it's a sort of really good intellectual exercise that how did like a lot of people have this idea that like, oh, they just couldn't fathom anything beyond monotheism. And it's like, well, hold on. When you think about angels and archangels and the right hand of God and the separate, like there's definitely already a playing field for God having a pretty big playground and a lot of friends, so to speak. And that's one of the really big reasons why I think Two Powers in Heaven is a really good book to sort of like, they certainly were monotheistic in terms of like one supreme godlike being. But when you start looking at ancient angelology and things like that, things get really, really interesting in my opinion. So yeah, great book, really recommend it.
I would like to study more about the relationship between Gnosticism and Christianity, because it seems to me that you could easily theorize that Gnosticism is quite an extensive system, and it doesn't necessarily need to have a Christian aspect to it or a Jesus part of it. He could have been infused into it, but that kind of very developed kind of religious theology, and I'm not speaking about any one type of quote-unquote Gnosticism, but just like there were many Christianities, there's all kinds of different groups that you might loosely be able to say were Gnostic, and it just seems to need a period of development to be that developed at the same time as, say, emergent orthodoxy.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things, like, there are definitely traits of Gnosticism that are, like, in terms of practice and ethos, secret wisdom, initiation rites, rites of passage, things like that. Like, they're old as the hills. So, the framework that Gnosticism is working in is really old. So I definitely agree with you that, Gnosticism operates definitely independently without a Jesus figure at the middle of it or whatever. I think the problem is the modern sort of terminology is we differentiate mystery cult, Gnosticism, and things like that. Like we try and separate them into their own little categories when I think there's a lot more fluidity between two, and a lot of it comes down to semantics. Perhaps rightly so in some aspects, perhaps not in others.
Sure. Well, terminology has a certain tendency to be rather arbitrary, and it's definitely a sort of inverse application, one that we use in the modern day to define something much older, which in itself has a certain flaw to it, especially with the lack of information we do have. But on these sorts of subjects, I wanted to kind of posit something, or at the very least kind of shed my perspective on it, on this sort of aspect. I really see from Christian Gnosticism. I'm not necessarily saying Persian Gnosticism, or some of the more modern kind of offshoots that came out of Islam, the ones that seem to be direct fusions of Islam with Neoplatonism, but it does tie into what I'm kind of saying here in that, and you really see this with Valentinian Gnosticism, it very, very much looks like late Neoplatonism. It very much looks like Iamblichus and Dionysius and a lot of the late Neoplatonists with a very extensive emanationist sort of hierarchy of various different gods and spirits. If you look at the Valentinian system that we're able to sort of infer from various historians, I believe Irenaeus actually had his own particular version that he was able to glean from it, obviously with significant criticisms. But there are aeons that they use that very much in a sort of way resemble our concepts of the 9 orders of angels, which in some instances were also integrated into Neoplatonic, especially late Neoplatonic, and I guess what we would just call Gnostic systems. And to say and to kind of reinforce what you were saying before about I guess a less Christ-influenced kind of tradition, you really see this in Valentinianism because, or Valentinian Gnosticism, in that Christos and Sophia are seen as a sort of bridegroom, a pairing. I think it's called a syzygy, which is a really specific term for basically divine dualities that were paired together in the Aeonic systems of Valentinus. And they were viewed as sort of the most important of those systems, sort of representative of that concept I said earlier of the logos, the Christos being synonymous with the logos. And you see a lot of these sorts of interactions, and it almost seems like Gnosticism is an anti-Neoplatonism, in the sense that Neoplatonists saw the demiurgos as a positive demiurge, an architect that was a direct reflection of the one, whereas the Gnostics saw as a sort of negative thing. They either saw their demiurge, or sometimes called Yaldabaoth, as a sort of impotent or even overtly evil demiurge. So you really see that in their interactions. They were constantly debating with one another in their early inception, at least the ones that we're able to see and have that documented. So I would argue, at the end of this long spiel, that a lot of what we would consider Christian Gnosticism is really a sort of Christianized Platonism.
That's a really good insight. And going back to way before I think you joined the conversation, it's this sort of talk that really confirms my thesis that I don't think Marcion was a Gnostic. This sort of stuff, these complex systems are just absent from his view. He's not interested in numerology. He's not interested in aeons. He's not interested in higher spiritual laws. What he's interested in is salvation. Salvation by faith, by grace. God's pure gift. And he totally agrees with the Gnostics that this demiurge, this creator god, is wicked and evil and this maniacal, just figure. But where he and the Gnostics disagree with one another, Gnostics tend to think that they, however, are made special from the beginning. That inside them is the divine spark, that they don't belong to the demiurge, they belong to the higher being, or the higher beings, that Sophia has somehow graced them pre-existently, and their true mission is to get back home, in a sense.
Yes.
Martin's like, no, we are all wretched create creatures, this demiurge, and it's only by the pure grace of God, of Jesus, that we are saved. And that's sort of, to me, that's like one of the biggest hammers in my thesis, that I don't think that I think Irenaeus was completely incorrect in targeting Marcion as a Gnostic. It's one of those things where if you didn't know Marcion very well, which I don't think he did, you can see where it's like, oh, he's got multiple gods, and like, of course he's a Gnostic. It's one of those things where you can make fairly logical conclusions, but when you actually stop to think or stop to hear the dude, he's not a Gnostic. So that might clarify a few more things that we were talking about earlier.
There's one last thing I want to say, and I'll leave the floor open. I don't want to hog the mic here. I honestly think that the main distinction between what we would consider a Gnostic tradition and what is I guess, more orthodox Christian tradition, even if you were to include Marcion as a part of that aspect, comes down to sacrament versus theurgy or theurgia, the sort of God work that you see within Neoplatonism and Gnostic tradition, the mysticism, that element, and it having an almost magical religious character as opposed to a more ecclesiastical character that we see, kind of reiterated and reformed and refined in what we have of modern Christianity. I would say that really is the defining difference between the two.
I would agree with that, and to sort of footnote, I would say, and what plays into that, in a sense, is also the difference between, I think, Gnosticism emphasis on the self in the very modern sense of the word, but also, and what you could call orthodoxy, proto-orthodoxy's emphasis on communion. I think that sort of plays in it as well to a certain extent, where the Gnostic, the self can save itself, in that very loose word, whether in orthodoxy it's a communal thing, it's a corporate activity, the ecclesia are involved. I think that has something to do with it as well. But I definitely agree orthodoxy, orthopraxy has something to say about that. So I agree with that. But it's getting past my bedtime, and my wife will definitely want my company soon. It's been wonderful talking to you all, and if you are interested in Marcion, one final shameless plug, you can follow me at facebook.com/author Daniel Galotta. So thanks, guys, and I'll see you guys later.
Take care.
What does orthopraxic mean?
Praxis in Greek generally means work, but it usually is a reference to ritual. It's been defined differently depending on what tradition you're talking about, especially more modern occult traditions. They tend to define it as magic, which is kind of ties into a lot of my issues that I have with modern interpretations of Greek words. But be that as it may, as a little sort of aside there. Ortho being straight, praxis being action, ritual, work. Doxia meaning belief, orthodoxy, right belief, correct belief or adherence to a doctrine or dogma. That's the defining difference between, as I sort of mentioned, between what we would consider Christian and also Islamic faiths, and earlier polytheistic and also Gnostic traditions.
So you're saying that for Gnostics, ritual was more important to them than a specific set of beliefs? I guess that seems kind of counterintuitive to the idea of Gnosticism, quote, quote, as being a certain knowledge that you were supposed to receive.
Well,
that
gnosis in the I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
There's a term that a lot of modern Gnostics like to use. I've been in various circles and talked to a lot of people in that sort of movement. They make the comment that there is gnosis, little g, gnosis, big G. Gnosis, little g is gnosis, knowledge. Gnosis, big G is how it's sort of defined within Gnosticism, which of course itself is a sort of flawed category. But to a Gnostic, Gnosis is more like how the Neoplatonists saw it, henosis, a sort of, and it's a difficult thing because in Greek religion and also in Roman religion, superstitio, the idea of irrational belief was sort of looked upon as being a negative in spiritual practice. But with the Gnostics especially, they saw it as a deeply experienced direct communion with the divine. That to them, gnosis was something that was experienced and not necessarily explained. It very much is a sort of, it's mysticism. It's a core idea of reaching something higher than what one's logos or nous can understand, than what one's mind can conceive. So yeah, it's very much counterintuitive, especially from a Christian context. Hence why it was maligned so strongly by Christianity, Orthodox Christianity. I hope that was clear. Are you still there, Shauna?
Yeah, I just didn't have a reply right offhand.
Oh, okay. I was just checking to make sure I wasn't having some server issues. It seems to be a thing.
Oh, no, you're not. No, I guess I'm probably having receiving issues because I kind of blanked on a little bit of what you were saying there. Sorry about that. So there's the little g gnosis and the big G gnosis.
Yeah, it's a sort of funny, quaint way of looking at it. But basically what it's sort of saying is that gnosis as a word within Greek has a very general meaning. But gnosis can be applied differently depending on what period and what spiritual tradition you're talking about. That's just a sort of general understanding, a sort of like mnemonic to understand that. The Gnostics were very specific about, if there was one thing that the Gnostics were specific about, aside from just the sheer massive divergence in the variation of the mythologies and ways that they went about ritual, Gnosis was intuitive. I mean, just in the general sense. That may be an oversimplification, but comparatively speaking, it was an intuitive process to them.
And where do you find information? I'm sorry. Where would you find information about Gnostic ritual? I guess I'm wondering what your sources are for this idea. I'm not disputing your idea. I'm just interested in hearing how you arrived at it.
Well, I'm by no means an expert, but I have interacted with a few people who have made concerted attempts to sort of reconstruct Gnostic belief, at least in an academically serious manner. Maybe not the most accurate, but as is probably already evidenced from the sources, we don't have a whole lot available to us, and a lot of it has to be inferred. I remember some years ago, when I was living closer to Los Angeles, I went to a small chapel called the Ecclesia Gnostica, run by a gentleman by the name of Stephen Holler. He's getting up there in age quite a bit now, and he's sort of seen as an authority in the movement itself. He created the website, him and his I guess you would say order, created gnosis.org, and he has a wealth of information. He's written many books on the subject and goes into detail about Gnostic tradition from his perspective, and he does definitely take it from clearly a religious perspective as somebody who considers himself a Gnostic and is trying to revive the practice. So bearing that in mind, though, he does have a lot of really interesting and very useful information about Gnostic philosophy and Gnostic thought, and at a certain point, you basically have to make certain, I don't want to say judgment calls. You have to make certain leaps of faith when you're trying to understand it. And most of the Gnostic groups that you encounter are far less academically serious than Stephen Holler's work, in my experience.
And what was the central purpose of Gnostic ritual? I'm going to say, there's the whole Christian thing is, Jesus is going to save you from your sins, so the whole idea is that you're wanting this salvation. And what is it that you're going to gain from Gnostic ritual?
There's a general consensus among a lot of Gnostic thinkers, academic and even non-academic, that the Gnostics in a qualitative sense, it shares a lot of similarity with Eastern religion, Buddhism, Hinduism. The idea of reincarnation is commonly held as a tenet that is consistent with Gnosticism and the way that it sees the celestial hierarchy, the way that it contextualizes the sacrifice of Jesus. Example of that, several Gnostics believed that he came into a flesh that was not flesh, that it was not that he was born of a man, but was more that he was so divine that he took on a form like flesh, and that his death was more to demonstrate that in divinity it's an irrelevant distinction, that you're beyond flesh. It has a very, very mystical sort of quality to it. But, there are many, many divergent ways of looking at it, depending on what, like I said earlier, there is no Gnosticism, there is only Gnosticisms. There are many divergent ways and interpretations, hence why any sort of reconstruction of it is to a certain extent kind of theory, more than it is practice.
Have you ever read Memoirs of a Gnostic Dwarf?
I don't think I have. Why?
I read it not too long ago. It's rather a naughty novel, but really interesting to anyone who's seriously into Gnosticism, I would think.
I mean, I'll be the first to say that, I'm not a Christian. I'm a pagan for all intents and purposes. But if there were any Christian sect, however loosely defined, that I would practice, that if I felt that my spiritual practice was representative of a sort of Christian ethic, I would most likely be a Gnostic. I take a lot personally from Platonic thought and early Neoplatonist thought. I don't tend to take a lot of stock in Iamblichus, but definitely Plotinus as a more contemplative and meditative practice as opposed to theurgic. But it's very interesting to note that a lot of the reasons why we don't have Gnosticism today is largely its focus, which to many people may seem very open-minded and very very esoteric, and its lack of ecclesia was probably its downfall, considering that Christianity became so closely tied with Rome and what it was trying to do in Europe. I do think it's sad, at least to me. I find that it's sad that was not an option that survived. It may have provided a very interesting and valuable contrast in the convenient centuries when Christianity took hold, that it was just not there.
Well, didn't a lot of Gnostics practice like asceticism and didn't procreate? It seems like that would be a natural way for your religion to die out, because number one, asceticism isn't all that popular with people, and number two, then you don't have the next generation of believers to take the mantle.
You're right, but to use a sort of cross-cultural comparison, if Buddhism is a sort of extension of Hinduism in the way that various Christian and Gnostic sects are an extension of Judaism, Um, Buddhism is very ascetic, and is wildly successful as a religion in the East. So I think
But that's
that,
because they've managed to adopt a large lay following that isn't really ascetic.
yes, and I think maybe that's a part of the reason. And John in the side chat makes a very interesting point, though it may seem a little, I suppose, cheekish, or tongue-in-cheek, that is. Gnostics were pretty elitist, and even in the convening centuries, some of the last Gnostics that were to ever sort of existed in France, the Cathars, were very much like that. They considered the god of the church to be the devil, literally. They considered it the devil. And they were incredibly ascetic and very isolated, and that sort of idea within that period was largely what led to their genocide. They were viewed as a threat. So it makes me think that, and you definitely see this with a lot of what Irenaeus said about the Gnostics, that it was viewed as a threat to that. They were trying to spread not only a religious ideology, but a political one. And that to them, it may have seen as a, yeah, definitely more than a tad, John, you're absolutely right. That it may have seen as a threat to the kind of social order that they were trying to create. I've made this argument before that, right or wrong, the way that Christianity formed as a church is largely the result of Roman imperialism.
I think that's right. And I think that the early church was Roman imperialism to a certain extent, that there was a concerted effort to be the one church for everyone, that there was a whole like movement to absorb the other churches, the Marcionites, the various Gnostic cults, and the ones that couldn't get absorbed were pretty much, knocked out of the way and possibly destroyed or possibly ignored out of existence. I also think that possibly some of the monasteries, and the priests, the orders of people that, the virgins and the priests that practiced asceticism in the early church were probably some of these Gnostic groups that were said, come on in, we'll let you have this monastery, and you can, you go ahead and sign on to some of our major beliefs, and you can be one of us.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think you're touching on a really important issue, and I've taken to studying more of the latter history of Christianity and just Europe in general. And one of the things that I've become privy to is the history of the Byzantine, which was the eastern portion of the Roman Empire that existed after the fall of Rome, or what we would consider as the sort of defining moment when Rome became, the church. And in those centuries, well into the Middle Ages, and some have even argued into the Renaissance, there was a very eclectic mixture of different cultures going on. There were, at least we think, there were pagan groups and Gnostic groups that were practicing largely in secret, as in the Byzantine, Christianity was the official religion. But there was far less of an aggressive kind of context of Christian belief. And that's largely why I think that it's Roman culture as it had formed in the late Hellenistic period that really defined the character of Christianity very, very early on.
I would like to know what Reuven means when he says in the chat, viewing Orthodox Christianity as the work of Satan is pretty consistent with the Bible. I'm not sure exactly I can figure out what he's alluding to there, unless he's also being tongue-in-cheek.
Well, that's Reuven. So we've all become well accustomed to his delightful sense of humor, of course.
Get on the mic, Reuven, and explain yourself.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's funny. I mean, you hear a lot of sort of ideas around about Rome as in its relationship to the church. One of the ones I've heard, I don't know if it's necessarily supported, but it's a very interesting idea. Was about revelations. Some people have suggested, obviously, they're definitely antithetical to Christianity, or at least contrary to conventional opinions of it. They believe that the events of Revelation were actually describing Rome, the fall of Rome. So it's an interesting kind of intellectual exercise. I don't know how well supported it is. I don't consider myself a scholar on the issue, but it's an interesting idea if you look at the sort of esoteric ideas that are in there and certain sacred numbers, the different forms of Greek and Hebrew gematria, isopsipsy, I think it's called. The Greek one is weird, really weird. But be that as it may. Go ahead.
There's at least one direct reference to Rome. I think there was something about a reference to the seven hills. I forgot exactly how it went, but
the Vatican, the seven hills in Italy. Yeah, it's reference to the Vatican, where the Vatican sits at least.
Yeah, so I think there isn't any doubt that at least some portions of Revelation are making reference to Rome. I think it's possible there was an old apocalypse that was sort of reworked at the time of the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem, and that perhaps later on when there was more persecution, there were some more portions that were added and it was circulated again. I think that would and it may have been circulated many times. This maybe during the Bar Kokhba rebellion when people thought this is it, this is the big moment, and and they sort of added in a few more details to make it fit the times and sent it around to everybody again, and that would explain why it's so hard to pinpoint it in time or to specific. Why it seems to fit so many different time periods.
And especially when you're dealing with prophetic wisdom of any religion, it really comes down to interpretation. A lot of it, obviously, especially with historical mythologies, is definitely viewed more symbolically. But as Christianity operates within the sort of paradigm of orthodoxy, it becomes very, very much an issue of what sect, what form of Christianity, and how they want to define it. And I guess from my perspective, speaking in my pagan bias, I see it as very semantic. I will be the first to admit that from my spiritual perspective, I actually do kind of think that Revelations is referring to the fall of Rome. But once again, I don't think that that's necessarily historically verifiable in Christian doctrine.
I would say that it probably refers to the hoped-for fall of Rome.
Yeah, that probably is very accurate. I'd say that's a safe bet.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of actual history that's allegorized in Revelation, but I think it's also making some predictions about the immediate future, and probably written, at least parts of it, post 70 AD, taking things like the destruction of Jerusalem as a sign of the final end times, and then it speculates about what that end time, which is supposedly going to be now imminent, is going to be.
It's always imminent. Always imminent.
Well, it certainly is.
1914 it happened.
Groups, right? Every little while, we're hearing about how we're on the verge of the big economic collapse, or I don't know, the Mayan calendar is coming to an end. There's always something out there that people are reaching onto that, everything's gonna, collapse and fall apart.
Break out the tinfoil.
The Mayan calendar is coming to an end again?
Yeah, that was 2012. I was amused and also horrified at the number of people who actually took that as being some kind of a serious thing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
You go ahead.
Well, most denominations seem to be living constantly in the end times. More of them more so than others, like Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. Their literature is just filled with it's their selling pitch. The picture of people in nice, clean suits and ties in paradise, coming soon.
Speaking of elitists, that 144,000, damn.
And they've already been accounted for, according to them.
Yeah,
there's no more room.
What I was going to say is to kind of draw light of my perspective. I mean, when I look at pretty much any other mythology within the context of those people, a lot of times when they're talking about more a sort of apocalypse or even just a very cataclysmic kind of change, it's usually viewed very symbolically, very allegorically, and could be referenced to one of many changes, a change that could occur cyclically, or a sort of change that they wrote down as something that will always happen throughout successive generations, and it's just not something that was really carried on into Christian doctrine.
What Reuven said in the chat about that the world already ended. We're in a parallel. That reminds me of that Ursula K. Le Guin book, The Lathe of Heaven. I don't know if you guys ever read that, where this guy had the power to reconstitute reality through his dreams, and that the world had actually been destroyed, but he brought it back into existence. And the rest of the novel was about.
Man, talking about elitism, jeez.
Well, his psychiatrist, I guess, found out that he actually did have this power, and he was trying to harness it and use it to improve the world. But every time he took control of the guy's dreams, trying to better the world, some strange things happened. He wanted to eliminate racism, for instance, and all of a sudden everybody woke up and they were all dark gray. There was no distinction between colors anymore. Just things were just subtly backfiring on him.
Well, at least it wasn't Rob Beasley. Was that bad? Was that too soon? Too soon? Yeah. Oh well, that happened. That's good stuff. It's good stuff. But what was I gonna say? Oh yeah,
unfortunately, Rob's not doing very many videos recently. I was just watching it on YouTube, and it was great entertainment.
Well, I mean, it is. It's a sort of schadenfreude of the internet, which I have a sort of distance from. I have a kind of odd relationship with. Sometimes I think it's sort of interesting to kind of look at people being ridiculous, but other times I think it gets kind of excessive, and that was definitely one of those examples. And I do feel really sorry for him. I'm just drawing light of the fact that there's a lot of crazy out there, justified in various different ways. What I was going to mention, I remember when I was in not high school, no, when I was in grade school, almost getting into middle school, there was this kid who was in my grade, and I guess his mom was like, I don't know, she was a weird sort of non-denominational, but having sort of weird mystical beliefs that didn't really make all that much sense. And he had this weird book, and I mean, there's like the fire and brimstone ideas of hell and stuff like that. The stuff he was describing in this book were like horrific. I don't know how like an 11-year-old would be reading this, or why, or when social services was going to be called, but I was a very precocious, child, and I was reading a lot from, the adult section of the library, so I was aware of these sorts of things. But I remember just thinking, man, this is some freaky stuff this kid's into. Like, where the heck did this come from? And you see sorts of things like that with the Left Behind series. It's very, very dark. Yeah.
I was thinking. But not in the Left Behind series. In the 70s, I read The Late Great Planet Earth, and that scared the crap out of me. Because then I started living in that imminent end of the world ethos.
I mean, it's like it just seems so reminiscent of a death cult, like a very early, like pre-Bronze Age religions, human sacrifice and just really barbaric kinds of ideas, and it's just I mean, Christianity, sure, cool. I get that. It can be a good thing, but that kind of Christianity is just, that cannot be healthy from any kind of, quantitative, psychological assessment. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I read a lot of things I shouldn't have when I was a kid.
He's shown
Dangerous
to.
ideas.
Oh man, when I was in middle school, like I said, I had access to the old section of the library, and I picked up a book. I'm pretty sure it was a Stephen King book or something like it, and it had very graphic, like adult content in it, like sexual content. And looking back at it, I'm like, man, the analyses that I made, very interesting. Just like I don't know what teacher allowed me to make that book report. I just I can't. I mean, it was like breasts and vagina and like just explicit and gore and violence and all this. I don't know. Maybe I had just a really liberal English teacher. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, my English teachers are probably the most liberal ones. I went to Catholic school all the way to 12th grade.
Really?
And I went when I turned in my when they were asking for books for the library, I turned some of mine in, like my science fiction books that I liked, and they were rejected from the Catholic school library. The nuns would hand them back to me. I don't think this is appropriate for our library.
I did have a really good sort of experience, and it tied very very closely into sort of my own philosophical preferences. There's a trilogy of books that was released by Lucasfilm's publishing company. It's called Alien Chronicles, and it was a very very interesting story that went into a lot of philosophy, politics, and it was sort of a sci-fi fantasy. So it had like a sort of subtle spiritual element to it. There were things that were paranormal in the book, but it was great because it was right at the cusp of being a little above my pay grade. Like it was definitely something that had the kind of high school level into concepts, but was definitely readable by a burgeoning adolescent like myself. And I really remember having a really good time with it. I got really good grades on the book reports I had. I find that a lot of that is lost on the young adults right now. The whole teen fiction. I mean, teen paranormal romance is a thing now. Like it's a genre. There's like a whole section of most bookstores dedicated to it. And the kind of stuff written in there, when I was growing up, barely would have passed as, fourth or fifth grade level comprehension.
One of my twins just got finished writing a book that he called Island of the Sea Monsters, and it's pretty good,
Yeah.
But I know there's a lot of fiction written for 15-year-olds like him, but I don't know many anthologies or anything where they're composed by, they're collections of stories or novellas and things like that by the actual teens themselves.
That should be a thing. Seriously.
I'm thinking about investigating that to see, if there's anything going. Maybe Dr. Price, because he has some connections in the publishing world, maybe he knows of something going. If not, maybe I could start something where I can also get other writings by other teens and then shepherd it through to publication if I could.
I actually remember somebody I knew from high school back in the day. He was very much into like alternative culture, and I think he was big goth back in the day. I remember that, but he was kind of mellowing out and getting a lot more into literature. I mean, he had studied a lot of Victorian literature and things like that, very much into the classic horror genre. And he was actually doing something like that with young adults. He was getting ghost stories, basically. I don't think they were just necessarily ghost stories, but it was horror novellas and short stories and things. And he had actually made a good collection. And if I remember right, he donated some of the money to charity. I don't think it was a huge publication or anything, but online now, I mean, there's Lulu, which you can do, self-publishing. Now you have Kickstarters and crowdfunding and all this kind of stuff. So the sky's the limit, really. If you can get people involved, you can make it happen.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to approach it. A cornucopia of ways to go about doing it, I suppose.
On a sort of related note, as a polytheist, I have played host to several people who have created anthologies. There's one group I can think of. I think they're Neos Alexandria. They created their own small publishing company, and they actually made an anthology of stories, like personal stories of devotion to different deities and things like that. And it was fairly successful. the book. They made a good, quite a few books actually, in fact, on that sort of subject. People sharing their personal experiences. So I definitely think in a variety of mediums and a variety of subjects, that kind of like compendium or what was the term you use, anthology, would definitely be a very useful medium.
I'm wondering, Reuven wrote Aragon. Is that a?
Yeah, Aragon is well, technically it's a series of books. I think that's one of the names of one of the books in the series, but they made a movie off of it. Yeah, Aragon's the first book, the primary one, and it was written by a teenager. He was what, 14 when he wrote it, something like that. Yeah, 15. Another one, as a point of comparison, Michael Crichton wrote the first draft of Jurassic Park when he was a very young teenager, and he ended up coming back to it when he was about 21 or so, and rewriting it with added information and more scientific context. Funny thing, and I have an experience that sort of confirms this, talking about short stories. When I was in middle school, I had a horrible woman as an English teacher, and I ended up having her daughter later in bio with a similar sort of experience, very condescending type family. And she tried to give me this really, really low grade on one of my short stories, and basically gave me just a whole ration of crap because she particularly didn't love the subject matter. And I brought that up to her, that if every English teacher gave such harsh reviews to children who were trying to get into literature, then Jurassic Park wouldn't have been made. She ended up giving
That's a good point.
She ended up giving me a passing grade on it for that because I called her out on her BS. It's a horrible thing when teachers put too much of their own personal bias into the work. They have suffice to say, they have a sacred duty.
Yeah, when I really started writing in earnest was when I was probably in 7th grade, and I had a really good English teacher that read the stuff and was encouraging. So that's the kind of teachers that you need, the kind of teacher I want to be.
And in all reality, we always remember the negatives, especially when we're teenagers, especially when we're children. And honestly, fortunately, they were few and far between. The amount of negative, just bad teachers was definitely in the minority. So I had much better English teachers later on who were very, very encouraging and very wonderful people.
Yeah, I have pretty generally good memories.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. I don't have any bad memories about religion. So, to me, non-theism and atheism, all that was an intellectual process that took years through, high school, college, and even beyond. So, but it wasn't a reaction to bad experiences of my youth or anything. I had, pretty good relationships.
And even as a devout theist, I respect that deeply. I hope that more people who become non-theistic come from it from a position of strength and compassion. Not out of hate, not out of bad experiences. They're able to rationally come to whatever decision they come to, whether that's non-theism or theism or even a religion I don't necessarily agree with, like Christianity. I find that those people generally are a lot more well-balanced and they're a lot more open for discussion.
Yeah, because I've never been a anti-theist, of any kind. Yeah. And I don't particularly believe in freedom from religion.
No.
I think, it should be freedom of religion or freedom of non-religion, but to me, it doesn't bother me at all, The only thing I would object to is paying for it, But other than that, if they're willing to spend the money to put the 10 Commandments on the lawn of the town hall, I really don't care as long as I'm not spending the money.
If it's privately funded.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I have no other problems with it,
Yeah, I've mentioned this a few times before, and at the risk of sounding redundant, I really think that a secular society is a good one for all involved.
Yeah, Dr. Price always goes on. It's none of my business what you believe, and I feel the same way exactly.
But you should be just as open to rationally and without contempt debate or criticize any religious belief. I think you're definitely as open to do that as I am to have one. And I've had a lot of very interesting and thought-provoking conversations. I think that there's a lot that theists can learn from non-theists, and vice versa.
Oh yeah, I'm sure I like to listen to debates, but I just don't have any more interest in debating anymore.
Me either. When I was younger, my early 20s, yeah, sure. But I'm 30 now. Not to say that's a huge milestone or anything, but yeah, I'm done. I'm done with that. I'm more about sharing information, sharing beliefs, ideas. It's more valuable to me.
Yeah, or discussing ideas, not necessarily everything turning into diametrically opposed views clashing at each other all the time. That really bums me out.
I mean, we've had dialectics for as long as humans have been around, but do you think that the sort of dichotomies that we experience intellectually is a result of more modern culture?
Yeah, I would say so, probably because of more people actually, the ideas actually becoming more accessible to each other.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Before, people were not really that. They lived in communities and people were more or less like-minded, and very few people were so cosmopolitan that they would be able to engage. But now it's become where everybody's ideas and opinions can be put out there, discussed, debated, and that sort of thing.
It seems to me a sort of, I don't know if it's rejection as much as it is a sort of cognitive dissonance to the plurality we have in society. We spent so much of our civilizations, so much of humankind being homogenous, at least from a cultural or national perspective, being very homogenous. And now we're not. It's very heterogeneous now.
I was thinking about that idea recently because of Dr. Price's monthly essay, Zarathustra Speaks. And in those essays, he doesn't hold back as far as his opinions on politics and stuff, and he's very conservative. And basically the last piece was on about pluralism and reactions to it and that sort of thing. But I began looking at, just history in general and thinking, yeah, there was a lot of cultures that became pluralistic, cosmopolitan because of their level of development, trade, and so forth. A lot of the ideas were coming in from elsewhere. Take Rome, for instance. And those civilizations seem to crumble under the burden of that kind of strain. And I'm thinking that hopefully over time that humanity can deal with pluralism a lot better. And I just don't. To me, it's not. Doesn't seem like a crisis like it would be, say, 2,000 years ago to have a society like ours. It's just that we're developing skills to deal with pluralism, where you can still be an individual and a member of a group, a larger group.
And I really think that the cornerstone of a functioning, stable, pluralistic society is secular government. A secular government that respects and honors belief and non-belief of many different types, but at least from an administrative perspective is unbiased, or is as neutral as can be, barring certain individuals' opinions and swaying of political parties and that and the like.
I had another observation. It just went right out my head.
Welcome to my world.
Well, I was up late. The Bible Geek Hangout last night ended up being in until 1 a.m. my time, Central Time, and that was way too late. And I have I had to get up at before 5 o'clock this morning to get the kids off to school, and I'm probably winding down mentally.
Understood. But yeah, it's definitely something that's happening in the conversation now. Having that space, having that sort of grounding, so that it's much easier to interact. And I don't know, maybe it's just my particular bias, but I tend to try to look for the positive, try to look for the more optimistic. When given the opportunity, I will try to look for the positive solution than I will to look at just all the negatives.
Yeah, if there's anywhere that I disagree with Dr. Price the most, it's in his Zarathustra book. And not just because, I'm a leftist and he's a conservative, because we have a lot of common ground, I think, between the two, because
Sure.
a lot of the motivations that drive conservatives and real, socialist types and leftist types comes from the same kind of basic perceptions about the world. That there's a basic unfairness, and it's just a different way of two different ways of solving the same problems that are seen, I think. So I always get along with people like Dr. Price, who would theoretically be at the opposite pole, but to me, it really isn't, in a way.
Yeah. Well, I'm a right-leaning centrist. I take a lot of conservative views that would, in a very basic sense, be attributed to like a Goldwater sort of conservatism. I try to relegate conservatism secularly as a less tied into social issues that seem to be, clearly Judeo-Christian, or at least modern Judeo-Christian sort of trappings. It's a difficult thing to do, and conversely, it's also difficult for many liberals to stay closer to center. I use this sort of analogy that if the political parties are a table, a long table, that liberals and conservatives are on the far end and can't hear each other speak. If they would only get a little closer to the center of the table, we could have a conversation.
It's funny you mention that, because when I was in my 20s, I was a very radical Marxist-Leninist, and I think the common ground then with the right was a mutual hatred of liberals.
Oh yeah, definitely, and there's definitely a lot of animosity even to this day. I just think it's a real shame for both sides, the way that things are being oriented. I'm seeing a sort of, it may not be totally indicative of the party systems, but I'm seeing a lot of liberalism taking a very particular, secular, if not atheistic bent, and a lot of conservatism being, very, very Christian in the way that it orients itself. And I think that's contributing to a lot of the just disjointed kinds of rhetoric and dialectics that are encouraged in political discourse.
Yeah, I think I brought that up in the first time that Dr. Price entered the Google Hangout. I think it was Hangout 4, and I kind of pointed it out to him, but after a while I just kind of let up. But I said, if I can understand that you're going to have liberal views on certain areas, but your basic outlook is conservative. However, but when you take a conservative stance, you're aligning yourself with people who have a basic philosophy that is in contradiction to your own in many ways. So, but I didn't want to keep pressing the issue.
Which is generally why every time that I have taken, like a political survey, the political spectrum test, I almost always, 90% of the time, I'm very close to center. And some have actually been slightly left, some have been slightly right, but generally very centrist, for all the reasons that you would expect.
Yeah, and I don't think any socialist party today would have me, because my views are also critical of a lot of the socialist policies and things. So I guess I would be a party all to myself, I imagine.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I'm going to throw a link into Dr. Price's last essay. You can read it at your leisure if you want, and
Okay.
maybe discuss what you think at some other point in time. But I kind of breezed through it and not really noted where I think he might have gone astray in his thinking. But this is a typical of his blog that he has, Zarathustra Speaks in general, so you can get a good idea of a lot of his thinking that's not considered, Bible geekery.
It's always funny adding RY to the end of things, or ERY, geekery. It sounds like a place that you eat and go on your laptop.
Okay, where's my window at? Oh, there it is. Yeah, I just don't really know what to call it, because we have a whole bunch of different people from multiple denominations, secularists, all kinds of people drawn together, mainly by the personality and thinking of one man, Dr. Price, but also we have kind of like this interest in the Bible in general, and a lot of people are, people look at it as, why are you even interested in this kind of stuff?
Well,
Aren't you an atheist? Aren't you out trying to burn Bibles? And it's like, okay, what could I call this kind of stuff? And most of the time, it's just tongue in cheek.
sure.
Call it Bible geekery just for giggles.
Well, I interpret it very classically. How do I put this? In traditional Greek thought, criticism, is applying a different discipline or subject to another subject matter. So it could be, in modern terms, it would be like saying, okay, I want to apply goth subculture to German expressionism, like something somewhat related but definitely divergent in interpretation, and see where it goes. A lot of modern criticism that would actually be considered classical criticism would be like applying feminism to comic books or to literature or movies, and seeing how that pans out as a sort of divergent perspective, challenging the idea. It's a sort of intellectual exercise, and that's what the critics were very much about, is challenging common perceptions of things. So I would just say that it's criticism, that you're critics in the general sense of the word, in the classical definition. It just so happens that because criticism is very much rooted in culture, and we live in the Western world, that it generally is at some point going to go back to the Bible. I think it's more out of necessity than anything else.
I like when you bring up etymologies and things like that. I really think that you don't see a lot of that online, which is very refreshing when someone has that kind of background.
Thank you. I've always been enthusiastic about study. I was taught that. And it's funny, you saying that you went to Catholic school and the whole thing. I was raised Catholic. And I was raised by fairly progressive, conservative, but progressive in the sense of being forward-thinking Catholics. And my dad's side of the family was very much about learning. Many of them had college degrees, and those that didn't went through certificate programs. They were hardworking and very much about culture and tolerance and learning and being respectful. So that's largely where I get my conservative leanings from, is a sort of social propriety.
Yeah, a lot of my good qualities come from my background. My parents were working class. My dad was a steel worker, mom a housewife. They were Democrats, somewhat liberal, still a little bit old school in some of their thinking.
Sure.
But, because of the strength of the unions back then, my dad had a lot of money, so they could afford to pay for private education. And I got a darn good one, I'll tell you.
Good, I'm glad. I'm definitely glad at that. I wish that was more common.
But yeah, there's still a lot of values that you mentioned there. Respect, really thinking about others before yourself. That was a big thing in my family.
And that was the experience that I had interacting with other families. When I was going through school, we knew a lot of Democrat families, like dyed-in-the-wool Democrat Lutherans. I had several friends that their family was like that, or Episcopalian, or whatever the case may be. And categorically speaking, all of the center-leaning Democrats and center-leaning Republicans tend to value many of the same things. They understood that personal accountability was important, respect, tolerance, not going out and doing crazy things in public, whether that is for your God or for your social group, because they both do it. On extremes, at some point, they're yelling and screaming at the top of their lungs, no matter what political perspective.
Yeah, well, my father was a character, very dynamic, very outgoing person. I'm more like my mom, kind of quiet, shy, retiring. But it was a different world back then. When I was real young in the '60s, and then growing up as a teenager in the '70s, when things started to change economically and so forth. But they were social butterflies. They started clubs. They had, they would play. They would go out, and I would have to have babysitters because they're going out and playing pinochle with their friends and stuff. It's stuff that it's hard for me to imagine me doing stuff like that today, because you're so focused on just economic survival nowadays, it seems. I don't think my parents would really understand this world because they worked very hard and they went through a period of a lot of actual fighting and sacrifice in order to establish a strong middle class, and they would just not even understand what happened to it.
Well, that's the thing with social change. It's usually very incremental, to the extent we sometimes don't even realize that it's happening. I mean, yes, there's definitely very broad-stroked kind of changes that happen, especially with civil rights movements, rights for African Americans, rights for women, and now a lot of the LGBT movement. But what I would argue, the fundamental social changes, the way government is structured, the way the relationship between government and the people is oriented, and the way policy is written is far more important than just looking at things topically.
That's true, but it seems that a lot of politics is centered around getting people to vote against their own interests by having them focus on topics and issues. That still seems to be a very common kind of ploy, politics.
Well, the general belief that has been fostered, which may or may not be true of all people, is that most people don't care. They don't care about anything other than the topical issues. And there's a term for this in a lot of politics now, one-issue voters. Whatever that issue may be, there are people who are just hardcore about abortion rights. You drive around the street at any time during the day, and you'll see somebody with a bumper sticker. And at almost any point, that person is probably super into it and votes constantly on those issues. And most likely, that's the primary, if not some of the only issues that they vote on.
Oh yeah, I would agree that happens. Yeah, definitely. What bothers me is that if you point out something like, okay, say you're pro-life, and you've been voting for all these politicians that say they were pro-life, and yet we've had Roe versus Wade for the last couple decades now. Every single one of those politicians never made good on a single promise as far as that goes. So, isn't there a point where you realize that you're being duped into just voting for somebody because they know you are a one-issue voter type person?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think I'm going to call it quits for tonight.
Yeah, you sound pretty tired.
Yeah, it's starting to slow down noticeably. But thanks, Ruben, for inviting me. And thank you, Kevin. It's been once again, it's been a very interesting conversation with you. I'm glad that you are hanging out with us Bible geeks.
Absolutely.
Alrighty, you guys take care now. Have a good evening.
Later.